Chasing the Mind, podcast number 18. History what? The Thanksgiving Story You Didn't Get in School with Dr. Shelby Balik, Part 1. Welcome to Chasing the Mind, hosted by Dr. Angela Johnson and Dr. Stephanie Schwartz, the podcast that explores the art and science of the mind. Each episode, we will feature a topic or guest who offers a unique perspective in answering the following questions. How do our thoughts influence our sense of who we are? How do we impact the world around us? And can changing our minds change everything? Today on Chasing the Mind, Dr. Angela and Dr. Stephanie talk with Dr. Shelby Balik, history professor.
The North, the Union, kind of won the right to tell the history of the nation's colonial founding by adopting Thanksgiving and creating a whole history surrounding it. At the same time, the South, they won the right to tell the history of the Civil War.
Hey, Mind Chasers, it's Dr. Angela. This is the part where you talk.
Really? I'm never in front of the mic. Well, it's not Dr. Kevin.
So we're doing a little piece in front of the interview with Dr. Shelby Balik, who I have to say was such a good interview, and I'm still reeling a little bit from all of the information that she gave us that basically undermine all of my assumptions about my history.
Yeah, they say when you go take college history classes, the first thing they have to do is unlearn you everything you knew coming out of high school.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty bad. But this was such a good conversation, and it's pretty extensive. So I think we're going to actually break it up into two episodes.
Yes, that's what we're going to do.
That's my husband, Kevin, the sound engineer, who's just like, okay, just tell me what to do and where to cut it. That's all I need to know.
Pretty much.
So we have gotten this out a little bit late because we had our oldest son, Graham. He turned 6 yesterday.
And we threw him a big, awesome party.
Yes, we did.
You know, with bouncy houses, and we actually took him to a place that has bouncy houses and big, huge slides and arcade games and air hockey.
Oh, and there's actually video of Kevin trying to climb the rock wall. There's actually video of me hanging off the rock wall trying to figure out how to climb it, but I didn't really get very far. He did much better than I did.
Okay, I didn't by much better as I got a few feet further than you did.
So this episode's coming out today, and then the second half of the interview will be out the day after Thanksgiving. So this is kind of our last chance to talk to our viewers before Thanksgiving. Dr. Stephanie's not here tonight because she's at a Carrie Newcomer concert, I think.
Viewers? Remember, this is an audio
medium.
Did I say
viewers?
Yes, you did.
Oh, shoot. All right. Our listeners.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So our last chance to talk to our listeners before Thanksgiving. So I think we should talk a little bit about what we're thankful for. You go first.
Oh, thank you.
No,
thank you for, I'm thankful for going first. Well, I mean, I have the usual. I'm thankful for my kids and, that they're doing really well and that they're all healthy, minus the colds. But I think that's part of what kids are supposed to do is bring colds home and give them to me. So,
yeah, he's sniffling today.
So, yes, I am sniffling today. So, if I break out into a sneeze, I'll cut it. And obviously, I'm thankful for you.
I'm sorry, what? Huh?
It has been the biggest thing I'm thankful for the last, few years.
Few years.
Yeah, 7-ish.
7-ish, yes, yes. Aw. Yeah, no, we just passed our anniversary of our first date.
Yeah.
These many years ago, 9 years ago. Because we're
Sure.
coming up on our 8th anniversary.
Mm-hmm. We are.
Yeah. It's a long time. It's almost a decade.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's funny. I remember when my cousin said something about, you know, when you've been married a long time, you don't count in years, you count in decades. And I thought, oh my God, that sounds so long. But it's been pretty much close to a decade that we've been together. And
It does average up at this point.
it does, kind of, yeah. So, well, I am thankful for you because you support all of my endeavors.
Like this.
Like this, as crazy as it is, but also because you are the person that I can trust with everything and be my complete self with. And that's a very rare thing. So thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome.
And listeners, not viewers, I hope you find things this Thanksgiving that you are thankful for and that you enjoy your holiday. I hope that the weather wherever you are stays nice and that your Thanksgiving turkey is cooked to perfection and your gravy has no lumps. And I think then we can turn it over to Dr. Balik and Stephanie and myself and an amazing conversation about everything from Pocahontas fetishism to how most of our history was established during the Civil War. It's pretty fascinating and shocking. This is the part where you talk again.
Okay.
So at this point, I think we're going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to do his introduction.
Cue the happy music.
Shelby M. Balik is an associate professor of history at Metropolitan State University in Denver, specializing in early American history and American religious history. She's published in multiple journals, and she's the author of Rally the Scattered Believers, Northern New England's Religious Geography, and she's currently researching a book on household religious practice in 18th century North America. Welcome, Dr. Balik.
Thank you for having me.
We are delighted to have you.
I've actually thought about having Dr. Balik on since we started the podcast because I'll just let listeners know I happen to know her from childhood. We went to middle school and high school together and played clarinet together in the band and orchestra. So we were,
That's correct.
yeah, we were super cool that way.
You know that the clarinet players were the coolest in the middle school orchestra.
That is so true.
And really, the clarinets really carry it. I mean, let's be honest. The flautists are they're just there to be pretty. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
It's the clarinets that are really, really doing the meaty work.
Yeah, if we want to do an after show, I can tell you how one flautist from high school has ruined Silent Night for me forever.
Oh, that's a story that sounds...
Okay, no, don't tell me who.
I'll tell you that it was a person with the initials KH and her inability to play the B flat. Like, I can sing what she used to do because that's how I hear Silent Night now.
Oh, my goodness.
It was supposed to be harmony and it was disharmony.
You know, middle school band.
Anyway, but we're excited to have you here today to talk about history and early American history, early American religious history, because it's sort of one of those times of year when we think about American history.
Yeah, and especially I think at this time of year and where we're in the New England area where we sort of think of the home of the colonies and much of the tradition and I guess some of the myths actually that we believe about this time of year. So we kind of wanted to get like a real historian's perspective of how we understand the past and how it still influences us today.
Well, I think the interesting thing about Thanksgiving as a holiday is that in many ways it reflects American history of later periods more than it really reflects the history of the separatists and then later the Puritans in New England. Back in early 17th century New England, if you wanted to talk about a Thanksgiving, that was actually a fasting day in church. It was a day of prayer. It was not any particular day. It was usually a Sunday. But it could be called at any time by a governor or by a minister or whomever, when the idea was that people needed to gather in church and pray. Sometimes it was for repentance, or sometimes it was because something significant had happened, or it could have been an occasion or what have you. What we remember as the first Thanksgiving was just a harvest festival. And it was significant in the sense that it was the first harvest, really, but it wasn't anything really all that unusual for a harvest festival. It wasn't the first one that anybody had ever been to. It just sort of came and went. Thanksgiving gained, what we call Thanksgiving, the harvest festival, gained importance later, but really as a regional holiday. New England would have sort of founders' remembrance days, to remember the days of the first separatist settlers. Sometimes those days would be spent in church. Sometimes there might be a meal afterward. Usually it was in the fall. But as I said, a Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving days continued to happen, and they continued to happen at any time of year, and they continued to be days of prayer. So it wasn't until quite some time afterwards that what we call Thanksgiving took on the name Thanksgiving and started to look like what the way we know it today. It really remained a New England regional celebration for a very long time. And then maybe it extended when New Englanders started to migrate, say, into Western New York and then into the Ohio Valley, but it still was sort of part of greater New England. In the meantime, in the southern states, they had their own kind of founders celebrations. They celebrated Jamestown. They kind of, I would say fetishized Pocahontas, created the sort of myth surrounding Pocahontas that a lot of people can't seem to break themselves from today. And so they didn't celebrate the separatist Thanksgiving. They didn't celebrate the early New England Thanksgivings because that wasn't their heritage. So there wasn't really any sort of unifying national holiday. The first time Thanksgiving became a national holiday, it wasn't even then a national holiday because it was Abraham Lincoln declaring a day of Thanksgiving for the Union, which of course, was part of a country. And he declared that in November. But even then, it didn't really become permanent. But the interesting thing I find about how Thanksgiving became Thanksgiving after Abraham Lincoln declared it a holiday was that the North, the Union, kind of won the right to tell the history of the nation's colonial founding by adopting Thanksgiving and creating a whole history surrounding it. At the same time, the South, what became the former Confederacy after they rejoined the Union, they won the right to tell the history of the Civil War by changing it from a war that was really about slavery for the Southern states, at least, and eventually for the Northern as well, to a war that was about pride and honor and heritage. So the interesting thing to me about Thanksgiving is that the history making surrounding Thanksgiving actually took place amidst other competing history making. And none of it's true.
Well, that's so interesting because I think, one of the things you sent to us to sort of think about this was that this wasn't really established until the midst of a war that was dividing the nation. And I grew up in New England, so I got the Mayflower story, and here's the rock, and here we are, and, the Indians, and they brought the corn, and we all sat down. Like, I got that whole story, and we went to Plymouth Plantation on top of it to, solidify the deal. So, it's just so interesting to me to even think about the fact that it is kind of a story that we're telling ourselves about the way this nation came to be and how we sort of interacted. I mean, there's all sorts of, things that we told ourselves about the way that we interacted with people who are already here. But I mean, even just telling ourselves the story of like what we did, that we all kind of grow up believing, and it's not really based in any kind of fact.
Well, the interesting thing is that after, gradually, especially after it became a national holiday, and by the way, even then, it was kind of an annual proclamation of Thanksgiving. It sort of gradually became a national holiday, and then, sometime later it was declared permanently, and then Roosevelt moved it back a week to extend the Christmas shopping season. But
really?
Huh?
I did not realize that.
Yeah, he moved it back to the fourth week of November, the fourth Thursday of November, because it was the middle depression. And what helps in part get a nation out of depression, a nation that's basically a consumer economy by that point, spending. So, so Thanksgiving was the unofficial beginning of the Christmas shopping season, and Roosevelt moved it back to extend that. But what I was going to say before is that it's really interesting to me how Thanksgiving became a Thanksgiving, right? They called it a Thanksgiving, which is never what it was. But it became the story of a nation's founding. One thing I think of, the Schoolhouse Rock, No More Kings, there's no Jamestown in there anywhere, right? The whole thing is about Massachusetts.
Right.
As the seed of the founders, and that really became a part of the public memory, so that in grade school, at least when we were growing up, and Stephanie and I grew up in Los Angeles, so it's not even a New England thing. The story of the colonial founding, right, of British North America was all about the Pilgrims and the Indians and Plymouth and this and that. And it wasn't until later, really, that you learn about Jamestown, which actually was the first permanent settlement, and in many ways was much, much more typical of how settlement in many places would go than New England was. And there were variations across the board, and so how Thanksgiving kind of became implanted in the public memory, I think, is very telling. Not necessarily about that first harvest festival itself, but about how Americans create memory.
It's very interesting because you've already said so much that bursts myths that I have had, as Dr. Angela said. I mean, even when you brought up the original concept of Thanksgivings early on, I was like, I did not realize that Christians had fasting holidays. We usually associate those with Islam or Judaism. Not something that's necessarily done anymore.
It wasn't even a specified holiday. It was more
a day of...
It was any day that a governor or a minister or whoever would say, okay, this is going to be a designated day of prayer and thanksgiving. And it wasn't a complete day of fasting. You'd still have a meal when you leave the church, but you'd spend a very, very long time that day in church, right? And you wouldn't be eating while you were there. So it was a day of fasting and prayer until the end of it.
I just think it's so interesting too, because I mean, one of the things we were joking about in the Facebook Live before we came officially onto the podcast was, that saying, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I'm thinking, yeah, but the stuff that we know is bullshit. So then how does that help us,
Every semester I teach at least one half of the survey course, and always the half that I teach is, the first half up through the Civil War. Sometimes I teach the second half too. And so I polled my class this semester when we were talking about Thanksgiving, and there's so many misunderstandings about it. About a dozen of them thought that Columbus was somehow involved in the first Thanksgiving. Now that's just that's not one person misremembering something. Clearly, there's some, I don't know, there's something going on in the way we construct the narrative of, however you want to call it, colonial invasion, colonial settlement, colonial founding, that, allows students to kind of merge all of these different, or interweave all of these different narratives into one. And I never even thought to ask my students that. It never even occurred to me that anybody would think. But I have seen some exam answers that say, yeah, Columbus discovered Florida or something.
What?
Or, was somehow involved in New England. And so I've seen enough of that to know that those misconceptions were there. But I'd never actually thought to stop and ask, who was at this event, and have people say, well, wasn't Columbus there? No, it was a really widespread misunderstanding. And then I'll just go to one school with one bad textbook. It's a local student body, but they're from all over.
But it does bring up the bigger issue that you're talking about, which is that people believe these narratives, and that people actually sort of, like you said, you kind of phrase it as like they won the right to weave a narrative that is kind of like, just the thing that they said, not necessarily what happened. And then everyone perpetuates that to like our current political situation, where we're arguing about, the fact that the Confederacy wasn't really about slavery. It was about states' rights. And that's why these, statues or flags or, whatever should remain, because it's about a heritage. And the way you're saying it, it's almost like, well, you can't blame people if they really genuinely believe that this is the history of their ancestors. Then of course they're invested in defending it.
Yeah, you can blame people a little, though, because the truth is out there, as they might say on the X-Files. One of the most gratifying things to me, I have to say, is that in the wake of, really, it's in the wake of the Charleston murders, right, in the church in Charleston. So Nikki Haley, who was then governor of South Carolina, decided to take down the Confederate flag on state grounds, right, in South Carolina. And that unleashed a debate over the meaning of the Confederate flag in particular, right? Well, here's the meaning of the Confederate flag, the Cliff Notes version. The Confederate flag was one of many, what we call the Confederate flag, was one of many, many different flags that the Confederate States of America used. It was a battle flag. Its image was replicated in various state flags, but it was never the official Confederate flag. It was consigned to, the dustbin of history, so to speak, until the Civil Rights Movement, when people picked it up again and decided to use it as an instrument of white supremacy. So that's the history of the Confederate flag. And so that discussion started, and then you started to have hashtag Charleston syllabus, which actually was a hashtag, and it started out as a fairly impromptu, widespread, broad-based collection of documents and readings, and then somebody put it together and they published it. In the wake of that, you then had other kinds of popular history collecting. I think there's an immigration syllabus. There are a few other popular syllabi. They're meant for teaching, but they're also meant for people to just educate themselves. Okay, so that was kind of the momentum. And then when the Confederate monuments controversy really blew up, I was really pleased to see that there's so much discourse that uncovered for so many people what these monuments actually meant. The monument building, the monuments to Confederate soldiers, they peaked in two very specific periods. The first was during the period of, early Jim Crow, right after Reconstruction ended. And the second one was in the 1950s, during the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. Those monuments were not to honor heritage. Those monuments were instruments of intimidation. And so for that history to come out, and then what came out was exactly how Southerners reconstructed their own history and the history of the Civil War and the history of Reconstruction to make it about Southern honor, Southern dignity, and Southern victimhood. The challenge to that narrative is finally out in the public, and it's really it's rewarding to see the debate that has resulted, however painful it might be. Here's what happened. I mean, if you take a look, for example, at Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. At the very, very beginning of the Civil War, when the Confederate States of America wrote its Constitution, Alexander Stephens got up and he gave what has become called the Cornerstone Speech. And the reason why it's called the Cornerstone Speech is that in that speech, he said, the cornerstone of the Confederate States of America is essentially white supremacy. He said, we are, and I'm paraphrasing very closely, I'm not quoting, but he said, we're basically starting an experiment. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, that was nice, but he was wrong. Our experiment is that we are starting a country based on the assumption that white people are superior to what he called the Negro, right? Well, interestingly, fast forward really just a couple of decades later, if that, I think it was even less. Alexander Stephens, along with Jefferson Davis, they each did this. They wrote multi-volume histories of the United States that instead of making the Civil War about white supremacy and the preservation of slavery, they created a narrative of the United States of America that was all about a nation built on states' rights, pride and dignity, and and small government, and and Southern honor. And then the Civil War became a war to defend that in that narrative. In the meantime, the daughters of the Confederacy started writing textbooks. They started building museums. They started establishing archives, and they sold those textbooks to districts and state boards of education around the country, starting in the South, but eventually in the North. And so they won the right to tell that narrative. In some version of another, that narrative has survived in American textbooks for a very long time. And if you want to know where American memory is created, it's not in the academic books that people like me write. It's in the textbooks that take that scholarship and filter it down and put it in everyday classrooms in public schools. And so to wrangle the history away from that, and to make it something more authentic, it's part of a live and vibrant debate that's really, really important for our country to have right now.
Yeah, no, I remember being in my high school class in American history when my teacher, and I thought a great teacher. I mean, I had never been as riveted by history as I had been before. And yet I remember distinctly the days that he talked about the Civil War and how it was not about slavery. It was about states' rights, because most Southerners were poor and didn't have slaves, which is, arguably true, but that's still not the point.
It's definitely true. That part of it, most Southerners did not, 75% of Southerners did not have slaves at the time of the Civil War. And so one of the stories of the antebellum South is how Southern leaders basically created a political ideology that rested on the assumption that slavery was a positive good, not just for the slaveholders, but for the slaves themselves and for the non-slaveholding whites, right? And that's what bound them together. It's not that there was complete unanimity in the South, because we see that there wasn't. West Virginia broke off of Virginia, for example, right? So clearly, some of the slaveholding states stayed with the Union, but they created this political ideology that invested even non-slaveholding whites in slavery.
That's interesting, because there's a lot of parallels to what goes on today in terms of where poor people hold their alliances and who they trust to support their rights and needs.
That is true. Their, populist rhetoric that taps into an us versus them dynamic, that taps into a perceived threat by outsiders, that's very powerful rhetoric. And if you're in a position in your life where you don't have a lot of hope and you don't have a lot of opportunity, it's a rhetoric that sounds very appealing because it makes it easy to see the situation as the fault of people who really have nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, we're kind of a far afield of Thanksgiving, but I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, this is kind of where we're at as a nation. I mean, even the Thanksgiving story, it's sort of, oh, look, there's this one day where, Indians and colonial people got together and had a meal, and then it sort of like gets rid of the many years of oppression and, just outright genocide of Native people. We just sort of like, oh, but there's this great one day,
There's this one day.
There's this one day. And I mean, I think there's a part of the conversation that we're having that's like, yeah, we have to like acknowledge that other part that we're not talking about. And even with like our and I mentioned this, the founding fathers, like, okay, so the founding fathers of our nation and how we tend to revere them, but they were so flawed, and so we have these conversations, and to have it in a nuanced way is really difficult because it brings up all of the worst things about ourselves that we don't want to look at.
It's true because in your own life, anytime you set somebody on a pedestal, they're likely to disappoint you at some point. And it's difficult, I think, given the way we learn about the nation's founders in elementary school, right? When everything's super simple. And it needs to be, I think, I mean, take my own children, who are now in 4th and 7th grade, but they've been hearing about this from my husband, who's also a historian, my husband and myself for a very long time. We always manage to depress them when they come home to these lessons. And then the dinner conversation is, well, actually, elementary school students probably don't need to be flooded with all of that. And yet at the same time, to lionize the founders without really at least acknowledging that they were complicated people, that I think does nobody any good, because then they're this sort of one-dimensional or two-dimensional image of them becomes so ingrained that it's difficult to look at them critically. And then if you look at them critically, well, then you're just not being patriotic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or if you suggest in any way that although the founding documents of this country were incredibly enlightened and inspired for the time, that they may not be exactly the same thing as like tablets brought down from the mountain,
Probably.
and maybe we could amend them once in a while or look at them critically. Like then you're not patriotic. You don't love America.
Right. And it's important to look critically, and it's important to realize that the founders were people and they struggled with their circumstances. I think it's also not helpful to say, on the one hand, to say dismiss somebody like Thomas Jefferson outright as a hypocrite for writing about, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. Okay, well, of course he practiced something other than he preached, but it's not helpful, I think, to dismiss him as a hypocrite. But by the same token, I think it's also not helpful to say, well, he was the product of his time, right? Because I don't think that we want to excuse 4 centuries of slaveholding and a brutal Atlantic slave trade and a brutal institution of slavery as well. It was just a product of its time. We don't want to do that, right? So we don't want to excuse anybody. And at the same time, it's a little too simple to say, oh, well, he's a hypocrite, therefore we don't have to listen to anything he has to say. It's important for us to understand that Jefferson did grapple with the issue of slavery, right? And whether or not it was an appropriate institution. It's important for us to look at how James Madison, for example, started out his adult life determined not to depend on slave labor. And then lo and behold, he depended upon the labor of hundreds of slaves over the course of his lifetime. And he didn't free most of them, at least, maybe not any of them. It's important to look at those people's ability maybe to compartmentalize. It's important to look at their struggles to reconcile their ideas with their reality. Because don't we all reconcile our ideals with our reality?
Right. We do. And that's the whole thing, right? Is that we're all essentially human with the same kinds of, better angels and, our vices. We all do this. I mean, we're all like, I want to be a really good person. And then, but I buy clothes from Target, and we all know that those are not made by people who are getting $15 an hour,
I use a lot of straws, and then they end up killing turtles. One thing, actually, Shelby, I wanted to ask you is, so we, actually in some ways all three of us, but definitely you and I grew up in Southern California, where there's sort of a less of a connection to history. I mean, when I drive from my place to Dr. Angela's, I pass by the birthplace of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And depending on which way I take to get to her house, I also pass by the house that John Adams came back to with Abigail Adams after his stint in France. So, I mean, literally, if I want to go get a coffee, there's history all around me.
Well, see, this is interesting that you say that, because what you just said reflects the degree to which New England history became the nation's history. Because growing up in Los Angeles, there was Olvera Street.
That's true.
There was, the mission.
The missions,
right?
Yeah, that's true.
There are historic sites where the Zoot Suit riot broke out during World War II. There is history all around us in Los Angeles too. There's the history of westward migration. There is the history of, the creation of the Sun Belt. So it really depends on what you decide is history. And getting, we want to circle back to Thanksgiving. This is a really good way to do it. Maybe you don't, but
sure.
But I think that the understanding that history is New England, right? History is colonial or revolutionary New England. And that's what we think of. That's what pops into our head when we think, what is American history? That's the triumph of the story of Thanksgiving. Right there, because it was never a foregone conclusion. In fact, it was less likely than, it was less than likely that the history of New England would become the nation's history. And that's almost the triumph of Thanksgiving that made New England the seat of the nation's founding.
Huh.
That's really interesting.
That is really interesting, because I'm trying in my own little non-history doctoral level brain to imagine how the story would have been told any other way. And to be honest, I can't think of how that would be. And that's probably just because I'm a product of years and years of being told this is the way it is. 13 colonies and,
The Southerners had their own founding story, and their founding story was how Pocahontas became converted to Christianity, married John Rolfe. Oh, and by the way, thank you, Disney, for making all of my students think that it was John Smith. Married John Rolfe, and then became the mother of the nation, right? They had their founding story. And theirs was older. So I'm not saying that that's the one that we want, because there are so many problems with the Pocahontas story. But what I am saying is that New England won that battle. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they would. And that's how history gets made. Somebody who is motivated enough to create a narrative creates it, and then it takes root. And now we all celebrate Thanksgiving.
I think what she's saying is that there was fake news way back in Pocahontas' time.
Wow, and they still really, even at what we think of as historical sites, you can sign up to have a Thanksgiving meal at Plymouth Plantation.
Yes.
And I, in fact, know people who have done that.
I when I was a kid, but you have to sign up months in advance, I'm telling you.
But it's like, and then they have actual Native American people there, and then people in costume representing
Pilgrims.
Pilgrims?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it looks and smells like real history. I mean,
well, then it must be.
Well, and I mean, we didn't really get into this, but I live in Quincy, and so we actually go to the church in the center of town, which is the Unitarian Universalist Church, where John Adams and John Quincy Adams are in the tomb.
Okay.
So we are,
and their wives.
And their wives. So we are the Church of the Presidents, right? So I mean, we're like right there, and the dead people are in the basement.
I still say New England is so much.
That's kind of spooky. Are you sure this is a Halloween show?
Oh, we should have.
But it's funny because actually John Adams' birthday, I think, is October 30th, and so every year they lay a wreath. On any of the presidents on their birthday, they come out and they have the whole group of whatever. I'm so like military.
We should go down to the crypt when they do that next year.
It's not a big thing. They like everyone comes. It's a big, they lay the wreath.
Is the church supposed to be haunted? Does it have any reputation for being haunted? I'm just curious.
No, I don't think so. Okay. I mean, it's very UU.
It's a Unitarian church.
It's Unitarian. If they were haunted, they'd be like, wherever you are on your journey, please come.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
They would be like saging and welcoming the spirits.
We're a welcoming
I think
church.
Adam's family has a reputation for being kind of uptight, so they might not be into the whole seance thing or haunting people.
Well, this is completely off topic, but apparently Louisa did not want. I mean, like she was not of the faith. Because originally this was Congregationalist. It all goes back. It's very Protestant, but it's not anymore. But she would not have wanted to be buried there. But of course, she married the guy, so they dragged her into the crypt.
But I was going to say, like, Los Angeles is so much larger and spread out that I have to say the history, it just feels denser here, even if there's a lot of history in Los Angeles.
It does. I know that it does because I've spent a lot of time in New England, and it does feel denser. But I just feel like that has a lot to do with what we understand to be history.
Absolutely.
But you're right. I mean, Los Angeles is spread out, although that in itself is, that's historical patterns of suburbanization, and so history really is all around you. It's just, what do you identify as history that is meaningful to you? And in Los Angeles, it's easier to miss, but I would argue that it's there.
Some of it's been paved over.
Some of it's been destroyed in an earthquake.
They paved Paradise and put up a parking lot. Can we go back to because I'm still stuck on the fetishization of Pocahontas. I really have to hear more about that.
Well, it's interesting. I do this exercise. I do it with my students when I teach colonial, and then I also do it with my future teachers, right? My teaching licensure students, when we talk about kind of how myths and memories are made, and I use Pocahontas. Pocahontas is like a blank canvas. She's literally like a blank canvas, and I'll explain that in a minute. But she's like a blank canvas in the sense that she didn't live very long. Most of what we know about her comes from John Smith, who basically used her story to glorify himself. So that's not really reliable. And so she met him when she was first 9 or 10, which makes the whole Disney thing icky. And then she met John Rolfe and married him, and that marriage only lasted a few years until she died. So she really is, this kind of open space, historically speaking. I mean, she was a living human being with her own thoughts and her own feelings, but we don't know what they were, right? So first the English and then the Americans have plastered on whatever personality they want, on to Pocahontas. So, and so anyway, so this exercise that I do, and the reason why I say she's a blank canvas is that I show my students images of Pocahontas over time. None of them look anything alike, and they all are, images that are deeply rooted in the time when they were created. So an example, everybody knows, or many people know, people who are up on the history know, the one print, the engraving that was made of Pocahontas during her lifetime. It had her Christian name, Rebecca. It had her, in the image of a well-dressed, wealthy English woman. And the purpose was not to depict Pocahontas. The purpose was to show that Native Americans could be Christianized and civilized, right? That's why they took her to England in the first place. And that's where she died. Well, if you fast forward a little bit later, I have this image of Pocahontas who looks like an 18th century housewife during the Revolutionary period. If you fast forward a little bit later, I have this painting of Pocahontas in her being baptized, and it was created during the Second Great Awakening, which was a period of revivalism, in which American evangelical culture was really about sort of perfecting the self, washing the body of sin, and undergoing this authentic conversion experience. Well, if you look at the painting, there's Pocahontas. She looks like a 19th century, Victorian woman. She is dressed all in white, and there's a shaft of light coming from the, the upper windows of the church, which, by the way, they didn't even have churches with windows back when she was living in Virginia, and it's shining down on her. You have her brother and some of her other relatives kind of off in the shadows, and you have this great mass of, English clergy and elites overseeing the baptism. Well, then you fast forward a little bit later, and I've got a picture of Pocahontas looking like a flapper that was created in the late 19-teens. Then you have, the Disney movie of Pocahontas, which was really a lot more about environmentalism than it was about Pocahontas, or at least, the Colors of the Wind, that song, right? Mm-hmm. And then even after that, I've got some images from, I don't know if it was a meme or if it was Vogue online or something. It looks like a Vogue magazine cover, but I don't know if it was actually created by Vogue. But it's Pocahontas looking like Beyonce, right? And so we've literally plastered the values of our times onto this woman about whom we know very little. And we have made her symbolic of what matters to us, in 1750 or in, 1830 or in 1915 or in 1992 or, and that's what she becomes. She's elastic because we know so little. There's this really wonderful book about Pocahontas called Pocahontas and the Powhatan Dilemma by Camilla Townsend that I use in my colonial class. And it goes into, who, as much as we can possibly know based on the cultural context of who this person actually was, but also why we have invested so much in using her as a focal point for our myth making. And it's a pretty fascinating read.
Well, why do you think that I guess this is kind of a silly question, but I mean, the fact of the matter is you can count on one hand the number of actual women that we talk about when we talk about history in this country.
Well, we can count on more than one hand now, but it used to be. It used to be that was the case.
Like founding wise or like going forward. I mean, like when you think about, I'm trying to we have Betsy Ross and the flag.
Oh gosh, that's another. Yeah.
Oh, you're like.
What'd you say?
Let me tell you about. Okay, this actually.
Oh my God, you started.
Betsy Ross is about the Civil War.
Really? Okay,
Yes.
I'm going to be quiet now. Go ahead.
Okay, so the myth of Betsy Ross is all about the Civil War. Here's the thing: there was a woman who was named Betsy Ross, but during the Revolutionary War, her name wasn't even Betsy Ross because she hadn't married Mr. Ross yet. I don't even know what her name was, but it was Betsy something. And she did live in Philadelphia, and she did work as a seamstress and an upholsterer. Now, there is no family record of her having any sort of encounter with Washington at any point about any flag. There's no specific record of her ever having made the first American flag. We don't really know who made the first American flag. We have some ideas about who might have designed it. But again, just like with the Confederate flag, if you go back to the Revolution, for the first year or so of the American Revolution, there were lots of different flags. There were battle flags, there were state flags, there were regiment flags, all kinds of, flags until 1777 when Congress adopted the American flag. Well, here's a question. So George Washington, right? He's got a job to do. He's fighting the British. He's trying to stave off, British aggression or what have you, right? Military campaigns. Do you really think he's going to go into some upholsterer's shop in Philadelphia when, by the way, he's supposed to be in Boston, right? Fighting the British in Boston to talk about the merits of a 5-pointed star?
I don't know, was there a cherry tree there? Because if there was.
There may have been a cherry tree there that needed chopping. But anyway, so where did the story come from? Here's where it came from. Not until it was later. It was around the time of the Civil War. And shortly thereafter, there was a family history published by members of the Ross family that created this story. And nobody in the Ross family at the time, who at that point would have been in a much older generation who actually knew Betsy Ross, ever said anything about her talking about this, right? And then there was this painting that was created, that somebody painted what they imagined to have been the scene of Washington and Ross discussing the flag. And that's where the myth started. Well, okay, so it's around, so let's say this all happened around the 1870s. What's going on in the 1870s? Be the students. Do you know what was going on in the 1870s?
Civil War.
Well, it was right after the Civil War. Okay, so that's one thing. Reconstruction, it was a very difficult time. It was, there are scars to be mended, right? And then the other thing, it was right around the time of the centennial of the nation. Okay.
We are among the slower students. I don't know if it's the hour. I don't know if it's
and this is why
the pre-partying.
But it was around the centennial of the nation, which of course was a time of great nostalgia. And because 1876 came on the heels of the Civil War, there was a special push to emphasize unity. Okay. So that's where this came from. And the Betsy Ross story appeared around this time. So did a number of other stories. Family chronicles started to appear in which some relative proved especially instrumental and helpful to George Washington that somehow none of the older members of the family had ever heard before. Right? There was this story about a spy in New Jersey who was especially helpful in making sure George Washington had the intelligence that he needed to know when to cross the Delaware River. Well, that's ridiculous. That never happened. There's no evidence that ever happened. Right?
I'm so scared to ask about Paul Revere. I can't even tell you. Tune in next week when Dr. Shelby will talk about the role of women in history, and she will bring things current and how the past informs our understanding of our politics today. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Chasing the Mind. Today's episode featured music from purpleplanet.com. Please visit our website at chasingthemind.com, where you can find information about Dr. Balik and a link to her book. You can listen to past episodes and read about upcoming guests and events. And you can find our link to our Patreon page. Our contest to raise money for Interfaith Social Services is still going. Find the link to donate on our website and at chasingthemind.com. Chasing the Mind is intended to provide information and entertainment and is not intended to substitute for professional mental health assessment or treatment. The opinions expressed by the doctors and the guests are their own and do not reflect professional advice. Information offered by the doctors does not create a therapist-client relationship. Please seek professional help with a mental health treatment provider if needed.